Hello, everyone. Welcome once again to Asking Different Questions. Today is exciting because today we are starting a new unit. It's the second half of the training series, and it's also where I'm going to start presenting new material that I have not presented before. So I'm excited about this, and particularly about this session. And so I hope you all are too. So I'm going to go ahead and move to share my screen. So welcome to this week's Asking Different Questions unit on restructuring, studying race and gender. This is going to be a unit less about, well, it is all about race and gender, but I think a little bit differently than we think about it, in that this unit is going to be a little bit more about questioning norms and recognizing how our norms are racialized and gendered. So as always, this is a series put on by the UC Davis Feminist Research Institute, where we are building more just futures through leadership, inquiry, and collaboration. And this is part of the National Science Foundation funded initiative called the Asking Different Questions, which seeks to provide intellectual foundations for justice-oriented STEM research, which is why you all are here. So the agenda for today: first, we're going to be focusing on our foundational concepts as always. Then we will move on to unpacking this concept of the norm, looking at how norms can cause or lead to the erasure or highlighting of the quote unquote other, and what kind of work we can do to reposition the center of our research. There's a lot in this, but we'll be unpacking it in the subsequent slides. And we'll end with some suggestions for discussion questions and closing. So to start out with some foundational concepts, the really big one this week is actually the concept of a norm. In some scientific research, there is like a, sort of a literal technical norm. So if you're like setting, if you're calibrating, an instrument, perhaps you'll have like a norm or a tare to which you set that. There may be an implicit norm in terms of what is expected when taking readings, etc. You can all think about that. And that's part of what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about more specifically, though, is who we study and how we study, and thinking about how the implicit subject, whether who is being studied, how we're studying it, who will benefit, is implicitly racialized and gendered. And often that norm is centered in whiteness and is centered in masculinity. That's just, where historic norms tend to be. And therefore, these norms are gendered and racialized. Just because it's a white male doesn't mean that it doesn't have a gender or race. In fact, that there is a very specific identity. I think when we really think about it, we can identify. And there's some really great research that has gone to demonstrate this. And so first off, I should also say that race and gender are social constructs. And what I mean by that is that these are not biological facts. These are not qualities that are inherent to our bodies. They are meanings that we as a society and culture have decided matter a lot to us. And we identify and classify people based on race and gender. We form identities based on these categories, and they very much do matter in this world, not just socially, but in material ways as those social relations impact our material bodies. And so while it's not inherently biological, there are ways that our interactions around race and gender do have material impacts on our bodies. And as always, I want to, remind us of the term intersectionality, which we talked about much more in depth in the unit on identity and belonging. I invite you to go back and look at that, to look at Kimberly Crenshaw's work again, if you want a refreshing on that concept. But in general, just to remind us that we are always thinking about categories of identity and social constructs such as gender and race in conversation with one another, and as mutually constituting and as creating unique experiences that aren't just like one on top of another, but are actually mutually creating each other. So this week, we're going to be focusing more on who and what can change the power dynamics around these norms. One question I want to invite you to think about, and I'm actually going to do a short poll here, is I'd love for you to think about what the historic norm is in your field. And so the question you see is like, you see is do you feel that your values, your interests, and you yourself are represented by the historic norms of your field? And so when I talk about like what this normal is upon which assumptions rest, here's some questions you might think about. Questions like, who is the user? Who is the observer? Who is the subject? So like if I say user, like who's the imagined user of the object? Who's doing the observations? Who is the subject that we're studying? What is the perspective that we're taking to our subject of study? What is the purpose of the research? What is the future use or outcome of this research? Who does this use or outcome benefit? Whose priorities are best served by this research, and whose perspective is dominating in this research? These are all sorts of different questions that you can think about to think about, okay, what is the norm here? Okay, so thank you all for everyone who participated in this poll. I'm going to go ahead and end it here. And I'll let you all see that we had the majority at 83% saying that they do not feel that their values, their interests, and they themselves are represented by the historic norm of their field. And we also see that 69% of those attending today do identify as underrepresented in their field. I'll note that's actually a little bit higher than our usual share, our usual percentage. So thank you all for that. It's always nice to see who's here. And the other question that I invite you to think about is like, how have you been taught to study race and gender? Many of us have been taught to think when people talk about studying gender, there's this implicit assumption. I'm saying this is a broad generality, but there's often an implicit assumption that you're studying women, or you are studying something, or perhaps like gender, something around like the non-binary way of studying gender. When you say you're studying race, it's often thought, okay, I'm studying, like that person must be studying Blackness or something around people of color, perhaps indigenous cultures. There's not, and in both of those cases, there's an implicit normal. That gender for some reason doesn't mean male, that's race for some reason doesn't mean whiteness. And so, I just kind of point that out. Obviously, I want to acknowledge that there is really robust fields now of masculinity studies and of whiteness studies. And these are things that are being studied, which is incredibly important. But that is not necessarily how these concepts are often thought of. So today what we're really going to be doing is kind of shining a light on that imagined like position from nowhere, that default position, to really like look at what does that mean. So the first way I want to talk about this is by thinking about the whiteness of science. I have a quote here by George Lipsitz, who wrote this really influential essay called The Possessive Investment in Whiteness. Well, it's not about science. I think it actually gives us a nice lens to think about whiteness in science. George Lipsitz writes, "Whiteness is everywhere in American culture, but it's very hard to see." So it sort of is like, this is the thing that colors all of our vision around what constitutes American culture. And I would say it is also the default that colors everything that we see around what is science. And so in terms of who gets to ask the questions, what types of questions are seen as valid? What are the cultural practices that are seen as quote unquote normal? How do we construct professionality itself? These are all things that are profoundly impacted by whiteness. And so normal equals whiteness. Another default within scientific culture is masculinity. And we can think about this in a number of different ways. One, we can think about this in terms of the norms of science. what is considered the historic norm that we study, say, in health research. That is traditionally the white male. The male is seen as the norm. The women who say, ovulates and menstruates is seen as a deviation. And so that, and this is in this case, I mentioned this specifically because scientists have often been concerned with this specific menstrual cycle and how do we create a new norm for this hormonal variation that women have and implicitly men do not, which actually ignores the fact that men actually also have hormonal variations that throughout the day, not just the month, and sometimes in even greater variation than women. And just the idea that a woman's hormonal cycle is extra, a variable that must be accounted for, implies that there is this other norm. Another example is who benefits. And so a great example here could be the history of who benefits from the original creation of airbags in cars. They were created to benefit a larger body, a more traditionally masculine body. And so those were the bodies that were made to better benefit from the protection of airbags, whereas smaller bodies, traditionally more feminized bodies, were more likely to be injured by those airbags. And there's lots and lots of others examples. You recommend looking at an article that's now in the chat by Tannenbaum et al. About how sex and gender analysis improves science and engineering. And the third sort of norm I really want to point out for us all is the foundations of colonialism, and how colonialism was also really foundational in the formation of science and, by extension, the work we do in science today. I chose this quote by Sir Ronald Ross. In the coming century, the success of imperialism will depend largely upon success with the microscope. I chose this quote because this really helps us to see how the scientific study was working to support colonialism. The reason the microscope was so important was because they hoped that the use of the microscope would help them to understand causes of tropical diseases such as malaria that were harming British subjects who were traveling to these regions for the mission of empire and colonialism. And so in this case, the who benefits are the British subjects. They were not necessarily, trying to refine the microscope and discover the origins and causes of malaria so that they could benefit local populations that were already indigenous to the area. This was specifically for the British subjects so that they could better subjugate local populations. So the beneficiary was very specific. And in fact, if we extend this to other cases of colonialism, there was not concern, for example, around how European diseases were spreading among native populations, say, for example, in the US. That was not a concern, that was not a driver of science. And yet, obviously, that was something that was having a enormous impact on people that were not deemed as worthy of the benefits of science in that historical moment. The flip side of the norm is this idea of the other. And the other is sort of like this person that is in contrast to whiteness. Whiteness does not, in fact, make sense unless you have an other, unless you have sort of these other races. And so what happens to the other? Most often, and it's easiest to see for erasure. So innovators or I don't even want to use the word discoveries, but knowledges that some people already had were erased, downplayed, or appropriated. A great example of this is how Indigenous peoples' contributions to the explosion of discovery that happened during colonialism. And I say discovery very specifically here because this is within the context of, a European framework of discovery. So, for example, they would notice what Indigenous peoples were eating, what kind of medicines they were using, and then use those observations to further their own mission of discovery, while ignoring or even perhaps punishing in some cases the indigenous people upon whom they are actually relying. We also see this in within the histories of gender, of women's a very different history, with women's contributions being appropriated and downplayed. I'm sure there's so many examples of this. We could take even just the example of the motion picture that came out a few years ago of Hidden Figures. That's telling the story of the contributions of human computers to the launching of the first space missions. We can also see the many ways that Black people's innovations within even in the age of segregation were ignored or downplayed. We can also look at how the benefits of scientific work are gendered and racialized. Again, I've sort of been talking about this, but how they sort of tend to accrue towards those that may occupy the white male colonizer position. Whereas on the flip side of that, pathology is often gendered and racialized as well. There's so many examples within the history of medicine, for example, of just the simple state of Blackness, the state of being a Black subject, meant that you are pathologized. There is something necessarily wrong with you. And this took the form of, giving name if a slave had a desire to run away, that was seen as an illness, not as a natural response to an enslaved condition. We can see this in continued work on deficit frameworks that are used in research, as we talked about last week. So what can we do about this? What are some alternatives, you could say, to addressing these norms that are exclusionary and the way that they position other groups of people in a more subjugated position? Well, one thing we can do is to resurrect buried histories, and we can see some great examples of that in a vast amount of research and new studies that are being done these days. I'll say more about that in a moment. We can reframe narratives. We talked about this a lot last week when we talked about identifying bias and the role of storytelling in science. Think about what kinds of other stories can we tell. We can work to change power dynamics. And there's some really wonderful examples of that. I'll highlight a few that are coming out of Indigenous studies. And overall, we can also think about how we can move our science from being one of risk assessment. In other words, how do we mitigate damage based on status quo? And instead think of alternative assessment. So how can we actually find alternatives to a damaging status quo? And I'll give some examples of that as well. So just two of many, many books that I'll highlight today. One is the book Black Inventors in the Age of Segregation by Rayvon Fouché, who highlights the work of 3 specific inventors during the Jim Crow era. Another really wonderful text is Alondra Nelson's book on Body and Soul, the Black Panther Party and the Fight Against Medical Discrimination. This is a really important book in that it tells a story around the Black Panthers and their role as innovators in creating a more accessible system of medicine and overall community well-being that continues to influence many of our programs today, and that is in contrast to some of the more dominant narratives that society has created around the Black Panthers. An example of changing power dynamics is what I'm going to talk about now. Now, what you see here is what some scholars have called a cycle of victim blaming and coercion. So in this case, we're talking about Indigenous people contributing to genomic research. There's a real desire, there's a clear acknowledgement that many genomic data banks don't necessarily have full representation. And so, okay, how do we get better representation? Well, let's get more Indigenous people to contribute to their genetic material. Well, that's all fine and good, but the system is not necessarily to the Indigenous people's benefit. I'll say more about this in a minute. So The cycle is that Indigenous people are told that they will miss out on precision health benefits if they do not engage, but they're without any changes to power imbalances that are creating research harms. So therefore, Indigenous people disengage from genomic research due to the research harms. But then they're told, well, you can't benefit if you don't engage. But there's no actual addressing in this cycle of the research harms. So a quote from an article that you'll see Sarah has posted in the chat, they say, a publicly funded research agenda with a clear path to commercialization, but without a clear path for Indigenous health or economy is fundamentally flawed. So if the DNA, or you could think of this even in situations of other medical extractions, the case of Henrietta Lacks, and the use of her DNA to create the HeLa stem cell line. In both these cases, there is this giving that the oppressed party or the oppressed community is supposed to do, with the idea that, that's for the good of science, you will ultimately benefit, but no actual clear road for how that is supposed to happen. Just this sort of promise in a situation where promises have a long history of being broken. So instead, some Indigenous scientists working in genomics have proposed an alternative. They have proposed that instead, Indigenous-derived samples and data accepted for research are considered the continued property of the donor or community involved. In other words, the DNA continues to belong to the Indigenous community, but it is just on loan to the researcher as opposed to being a gift that the research community gets to keep forever. So I like to think of this as almost like an ongoing informed consent process. So normally in our research of informed consent, it's a momentary thing. Yes, people can withdraw at any time, but really once you have their data, it's generally sort of like this, there is no sort of further path to continue to ask for consent. They may, of course, choose to ask, that material be revoked or whatever, but there's a lot of hoops to jump through often to do that. In this case, this is sort of like, they may choose to loan their DNA to a particular research project, but then it becomes theirs again. And then if another researcher wanted to use that information, they would have to ask again. So it's an ongoing process of consent. Now, there's obvious tensions in this type of model with open data initiatives, but I think that's actually a really productive tension for us to think around, because it encourages us to think around how important is context to data sets, and when is context more important than perhaps in other cases, or is it always really important? And what is lost when we don't acknowledge context? What tends to fall out when we aren't forced to think about changing power dynamics in our research? So here's a few questions for us to think about. One, I encourage you all to think about, what is the historic norm or status quo upon which work in your field rests? And again, here is where it's really helpful to be specific. Chances are, unless you're working out of ethnic studies, you could say, white masculinity in a colonialist setting. Well, yes, that's, fine, but how can we get more specific? How can you look at, say, like, the quote unquote, like, founders in your field, and what was their complicity? Is there any relationship between your field and eugenics? Which there are for many. So if there is, you're in much company. And then look at, how are these historic norms still present in the field? Who is erased and positioned as other in these norms? So, is this historic norm still kind of with you, with the field somehow? And oftentimes there are subtle or not so subtle ways that is the case. 3, I want you to think about, how can your plan for change take part in repositioning norms, change power dynamics, or reframe the narrative? So how within the work you're trying to do can you use some of these repositioning strategies? And 4, how can your plan for change, the thing that you're thinking about doing, propose new alternatives rather than just mitigating risk? I didn't say, I forgot to talk about that. This concept, I want to say a little bit more about that. So in risk mitigation is kind of like figuring out like how much lead paint can a kid eat before it causes brain damage. Um, and then setting the standard there. I mean, obviously we know that's like, but, or how much chromium can be in our water before we're not okay with it. That's a risk mitigation approach, a risk management approach, a sort of mitigating risk approach. Like what's the minimum to which we can make people, a minimum standard to which we can hold people. And as we know, in the world we live in, that tends to be the standard to which people then rise. Instead, we could think about an alternative framework. How, instead of asking those questions, we can say, well, what is it that's putting chromium in our water in the first place? Or how can we create systems, as we have it in many places with lead paint, where this just isn't an issue. How can we, instead of just trying to figure out how to make the problem smaller, instead, how can we actually address the root of the problem, or just propose something totally different? And this is a framework that helps to bring about new status quo, because when we're talking about mitigating risk is not questioning that status quo, whereas proposing an alternative is. So in closing, I'd encourage you all to, one, remember that histories of white supremacy, patriarchy, and colonialism have shaped the norms of research, and they continue to resonate with us today. We also encourage you to remember that most fields are biased by erasure and towards further erasure. So in other words, the default will be some form of erasure, and it takes active effort to undo this. It's not something that just happens passively. And finally, I want to encourage you all to do research centered on finding alternatives to risk mitigation that center those who are historically marginalized. And we'll be talking next week more explicitly about ways to do this when we talk about how to value community expertise in research. So I hope that builds on this, on today's unit, hopefully nicely. I'll just do a quick review of some pieces from last week that I wanted to return to. I know many of you, after our last session, did take part in some visioning processes, thinking about what would be your vision for your research or the type of work that you want to do in the world. And there's a few things I wanted to remind you about. One is that the level of the specific vision that you have may be at any of these layers. And so you may be having more of a personal vision. You may be having more of a vision for your lab. You may be having a vision for your field, or perhaps academia writ large, or society itself. These are all wonderful levels at which to engage in visioning. And ultimately, we will be thinking, you will be thinking across these layers, because having the big level visions is really wonderful, because that can be sort of like a compass. The challenge of that is that it often can leave you as an individual in your daily life not really sure what to do. Having that more individual, that vision more at the localized level or your own individual level is wonderful, because then you may say, okay, I know what to do. But if things go a little off, as they inevitably will, if you don't have that big vision, it's easy to kind of drift or not necessarily have the compass you need. So you need both, but I just kind of wanted to say, no matter where you're starting, that's great. And just kind of like continue to think of these as interwoven. And the last thing, and I also just wanted to put these steps up, because I know some of you will be continuing to do this work. So if you last week were thinking about your vision, you may continue to do that work this week, or you may be working on to identifying problems and challenges, and then setting the goal and making the plan. I'll be continuing to put this specific slide up at the end of sessions, so that if you are making plans based on the work that we're talking about here, you have this to remind you as a tool. Because ultimately we did put, that's really what we want. We want people to leave these sessions not with just like, great, I learned something, that's wonderful. We want people to actually have the capacity to put this into action. And so I'll be providing sort of like little tools of support at the ends of each at the end of each week, in the hopes that that can support you all in that work. And if there's anything that you would like me to particularly comment on, please let me know. My email is on the FRI website, and reach out, and I'd love to hear from you. So with that, I want to thank you all for being here today, and hope you all have wonderful weekends and wonderful discussions or your own ruminations.